The only place, I've been using this, if you can hear my voice, clap once, technique to get crowds under control. It does not work with economic theorists. N equals 2. Okay. I'm going to talk about a very somewhat precise neural autopilot theory of habit. And first part, I'm just going to show you a kind of graphic and notational picture of what's going on. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I know there's not many true believer economists in the audience, but the kind of competing theory of habit as used in economics and marketing to some extent is that the more you do something, the more you like doing in the future. And the theory I have in mind will overlap with that in some respects, but is really fundamentally different. And then I'll say something about price elasticities, and finally a little bit about analysis of the 24-hour fitness data, a subsample of the step-ups, not the big 4 million that they have. Okay, so the idea is that there's something we call a state, and the concept of state we use is actually pretty similar in computational neuroscience and in economics and marketing. Or a state's going to refer to a choice set, as well as a bunch of environmental and internal variables which may affect decision making or preferences and so forth. So this is the Red Door Cafe at Caltech, which is new, and the state of myself as I go to lunch here may include, ghrelins and stomach biological variables that determine hunger, what time of day it is, whether I'm with a particular person who somehow cues, to eat kale or pepperoni pizza, and so on. So a state is going to include the choice set and then all these other variables that may influence behavior. Okay. This is part of the menu. I'll call this a consideration set. There's a bigger menu, but we'll just focus on these. And so I'm going to come in and buy one of these things. I did this last week. And so when the state was S sub t, I bought ham. Okay, so the choice at time t, when I was in state st, and remember the state includes the choice set, so there'd be other states in which ham is unavailable and so on. I bought ham, okay. And after I bought the ham, I'm going to update 2 numbers. And again, the model here is a very familiar one coming from computational neuroscience. Originally, basically it's a kind of descendant of animal learning, Rescola-Wagner type RL, and the way computer scientists have thought about these processes to program rollouts, things like that. Sutton Bartow. So the 2 numbers I'm going to update are no laser pointer. Okay.
Just use your finger pointer.
I can't do that because when my students try to do it, I say, "Oh, we need to surgically implant a laser pointer in your finger." Okay.
They would do it.
Exactly. Extra credit. So we're going to update 2 numbers, which is a subjective value of ham. So the key here is going to be that you're learning. You don't have preferences. You're kind of learning about subjective values. And the subjective value could be indexed by time t because there may be some non-stationary, the quality of the ham changes, or there's seasonality if there's seasonal stuff like lettuce. So this is the reward of ham. Okay. And this v you could think of as a running total. So we're just going to kind of adaptively update the v value, the subjective value of ham, and then that's going to be used to determine decisions. And so this part here is called reward prediction error. This is a sort of workhorse thing in computational neuroscience. And I'm also going to update, this is really the interesting sort of special thing. I'm going to update a second number, which we'll call d. You can think of that as reward deviation. And the second number is going to be the absolute value of the reward prediction error. So that's going to keep track over time of how reliable the rewards are. If I keep getting the same reward value each time, the v's will catch up to the r's, the reward prediction error will go to 0, and the absolute value of reward prediction will go to 0. Okay, so if I keep getting the same thing, v's will catch up to r's. That means the reward prediction error goes down, and the d shrinks. Okay. And so that's called the reward reliability, or sometimes called unsigned reward prediction error. And just to preview, the key to habit is going to be that a habit is when d is small. That's the tail that's going to wag the dog. Okay. So the next time I go to shop, if I show up in the same state variable, so like the same place, and I'm in a similar biological condition and a similar time, and by the way, which of those environmental features is a state variable that will trigger habit is an empirical question. Right? It's an empirical question. And eventually we're going to use machine learning to figure out what possible state variables actually determine the habituation. So a habit is going to be execution in a particular state. What the state is, we're going to find out empirically. Okay, so the first thing you do when you walk in this theory is you say, what did I choose last time when I was in this state? The answer is ham. What's the value, the D value of ham? The deviation value. If it's low, I get ham again. Low means if D is less than some threshold sigma. That means the reward if ham is reliable, I should get a ham again. That's the habit mode. And the key is very little processing is needed. All I think is, what I have was the same as always. Yeah, again, that's it. That's what habit mode is for. That's why it's like autopilot. Okay? And in fact, unless the rewards vary a lot, this is a very good approximation to optimal behavior in some loose sense. Okay. That's habit mode. If the D value is above the threshold, so it basically, I had ham last time. You know, it kind of varies. Sometimes it's really good here and sometimes it's not. Then I don't automatically choose ham. I go, that's the reward reliability of ham is unreliable. I'm in model-based mode, we call it. And then I look at the full menu, I assign a bunch of, I recall these V values. Remember, these are like running variables that, I don't like to call them utilities because I don't want to confuse economists who have a very special meaning or 3 for those. So these are subjective values which are changing over time as we learn about what we really like. And possibly if there's stationary changes in the quality of the food or the prices. Okay, so I look at all these V's, chicken is the highest, and so I consume chicken, I eat it, and then I update the subjective value of chicken and the reward reliability D of chicken. Okay. All right, and let me add one more thing, which is, where does things like self-control come in? What self-control comes in is that when we think about the reward updating, we're not including, say, future health consequences. So self-control may mean that the R value that we use in training that we like is missing, say, some future value. Okay, so you can add in lots of little elements in this model if you want to include different things. Okay, oh, I should add one more important thing, which is the kinds of habitized behavior I have in mind are going to be things that are repeated fairly regularly and end up becoming kind of motor automatic, like commuting to work, your bathroom ritual in the morning and evening, food choices that happen 3 times a day. Like that?
Can you get utility just from the habit? Like, when I go to this store, I get ham because I always get ham and then I don't have to think. Is that included? Is that included in utility?
I think that's one way to think of it, which people like Tony Dickinson talks about that, is that we originally, we choose the ham sandwich because we get kind of value from the ham. But if you think about something like a motor activity, it's almost like the value transfers upstream to the execution of the action itself. And I'll say a tiny bit about that later. Yeah, you can think of it that way. So, okay, here comes state dependence. In economics and psychology, some areas of psychology, like more mathematical psychology, and marketing, a whole bunch of words are used to mean something different than what I mean by habit. Brand loyalty, inertia, state dependence. And what all those words boil down to, this is, believe it or not, this is like the simplest math I can find to show you. The Becker-Murphy math is really a mess. What it boils down to is we're going to choose something with probability y, and that choice probability of a particular good will depend upon k. Well, what's k? K is the brand capital. This is literally the term that's used by Brunenberg et al. And k is going to be a discounted, this is a backward-looking discounted history of when I bought A, Y before. So what this math boils down to is, why do I buy this thing? I bought it a lot in the past, so K is high, and because K is high, it increases the chance I'll buy it again. Right, this is the state dependence. So if you buy a lot, if you bought it a lot, you buy a lot. And that's not what my model has to do with. The driver of the habit model I have in mind has to do with this reward reliability. You buy it a lot because it's been reliable, not because you bought a lot previously. Okay, and to be honest, I think that this is just a giant kind of misspecification. The idea and also the prediction from this type of model, right, that buying things a lot in the past, that's Y being high, generates a K, and K generates a Y. That's a byproduct of the underlying process. So if you follow somebody around and you look at a time series of what they buy, you're going to see these strings of time where they bought ham. And it's not because more ham purchase made them more excited to buy ham. More ham purchase made them learn that ham is really rewarding and you should buy it. Okay. Again, in comparison to this state-dependent change in preferences model, yeah, Wendy?
I didn't mean to interrupt you in the middle of the thought, but I wondered how your idea of reward reliability relates to the common finding on habit formation that intermittent rewards are actually more effective at building habits than fixed rewards or continuous rewards.
Yeah. That's a challenge for us. I mean, it's similar in the reinforcement literature in general, right? Normally you would think more regular reinforcement and deterministic reinforcement should be better than stochastic, reinforcement. And I don't have any better explanation for that. And that's the challenge.
Well, I wonder if you want to differentiate between habit formation and habit performance. It seems like your model handles habit performance once they're formed.
Right.
And maybe doesn't capture quite so much habit formation.
Yeah.
Which might depend on these other things.
Yeah, exactly. And the point of these computational models, the way we think of it is, we're kind of always looking for where would you add something in and what would it be if there's a first order phenomenon like partial reinforcement somehow being more powerful. And we haven't thought about how to do that. Okay, let me move along. So the other thing, what drew us to this model and thinking about it like a psychologist with a lot of help from Wendy in reading her papers and kind of visiting with her, is the state-dependent kind of Becker-Murphy, Brandenburg type model. It misses two things, which comes from the way David Marr and others have thought of explanations in neuroscience, which is, so I went to models that are going to do three things, which is to tell us why, like what's the point of habit? Why do we, what is it good for? It's going to tell us what, like algorithmically, what does it look like? And those are the equations I showed you. And it's also going to tell us what's the biological mechanism. How is this implemented in, say, human behavior, and is it implemented similarly in different species? And so the state-dependent model doesn't tell us about why. Why would it be that if you buy something a bunch of times, you want to buy it more? Like, but that could be quite maladaptive. And it doesn't tell us anything about the biological mechanism. Okay, so again, I'm giving a very radical kind of neuroeconomic view, which is I think that the models that don't tell us about why and how are not candidate serious models for me. And so the answer for the habit model is, remember, if there is a string of rewards which are very constant, the model will learn that, the D value becomes low, and you can quickly get a pretty good lunch every single day without having to stare at all day. What is the algorithm? It's basically what I showed you, and there's some biological evidence, in this case from John O'Doherty and Bernard Berlin, that in rats and humans, there's some homologous activity in different brain regions that implement habit and non-habit, including like lesion studies where you lesion part of the rat brain and they no longer execute habits in the same way. Okay, again, what's interesting about the habit model is you're going to observe persistence of choices, like Katie showed you. Right? The best predictor of what you're going to do next time is what you did recently. It's also going to generate some interesting thoughts about elasticity. So elasticity is the name in economics for the percentage change in demand divided by the percentage change in price. And when you use percentages, it becomes unitless. So you can compare these price sensitivities across different domains. And we think that the neuroeconomic habit autopilot model is also going to tell us that when you're in habit mode, you'll do things quickly. You won't remember much about it. You may have a hard time explaining to other people why you did it, because part of habit mode is to save time at scarce executive function. Here's a demand curve. This comes from a very complicated analysis, actually a simple analysis of two goods. Suppose you have two goods, A and B, you have to buy one. If you draw the demand curve in habit mode, it has a flat part. This is a range of prices. This is a range of prices in which the quantity demanded is exactly the same. So you can get an inelastic demand. If price changes are small, then the D value is too small to cross the threshold, then you'll hide a hand. Finally, here's some 24-hour fitness data. I'm going to end with one thing. These are a subsample that we have been looking at, kind of like a practice sample. So first of all, time of day, you get an interesting seasonality pattern, mostly morning and evening. Interestingly, the average visits per day, excluding holidays, is not fresh start peaked at Monday. It's actually Tuesday, and then it sort of goes down during the rest of the week. And this is a total visit density. This is total visits showing, as anyone who's worked with these sort of data knows, a lot of people don't go hardly ever. They sign up and then quit going, and then there's a tail of people who are very persistent and go all the time. Okay. So last thing I want to say is, one of the things we'd like to be able to machine learn is at what level of aggregation do habits operate. So in the example I gave you, the habit is like, what sandwich do I buy this time? But the habits could level at the level of like meat versus veg, right? Or if in the case of gyms, it could be that my habit is to go to the gym at the same hour every day. Like I have a morning habit or an evening habit. It could be that it's the same day every week. It could be there's different days every week and different hours, but every week I go 3 times. And so the machine learning is going to basically search for variables at which the habit is aggregated, which are quite predictable. Habit is going to be, is it the case that if I look at, say, weekly gym attendance, that I start out and weekly gym attendance moves around 3, 5, 0, 0, 1 days per week, and then over time it settles down, and then the variance in gym attendance is very low. I go 3 times a week, 3 times a week, 3 times a week, 3 times a week. So that's going to, this is separate from the neuroeconomic model, but that's going to be a marker of habituation in the sense of low variance in execution of the choice. And so here's what that might look like. So these are some data we just worked with. This is the variance of the number of visits per week. Okay, and so again, variance declining means week after week after week after week, these people are going the same amount of time each week. Okay, and you can see it goes down, and this is a cubic. It's very lawful, at least fitting with a cubic. It starts at very high because a lot of people go early on and then can quit. But the average attendance also goes down. So it could be that, for example, the variance of attendance is going down because a lot of people are just switching to 0 and 1s and 0s and 1s. So you kind of like to look at the variance like scaled by the average, like a relative quotient, some of the quotient of the variation. And when you compute that, for weekly, it looks like this. It's pretty noisy, partly because the scale is fine-grained, and you're dividing one number that moves around from another that moves around, but it does have a downward trend. That is, there's habituation in the sense that the variability of how much you go from week to week to week to week starts to go down. And if you do it on a monthly basis, it looks a little better, partly because monthly activation squeezes out quite a bit of noise. So the conclusion from this kind of thing, the tentative conclusion is, what a habit is going to look like empirically, independently of the model, is low variability of behavior in some time window of aggregation. And the steepness of the monthly slope is a little bit higher, so it looks like monthly habituation is sort of a better working model than weekly. And finally, to do, I'm going to skip this part, to do this type of work we need 3 things: donation, thank you to the Chen family and Sloan Foundation, and also obviously to HCEO, inspiration, and some came from Wendy, and from some very early experiments in animal learning, and the final is perspiration, which is from these characters and our heroes who worked on this too. Okay. Now it's time to applaud.
Somewhere. So let me do something a little different. So each of the presenters right in this session is sort of talking in a different way about what we see as the future of BCFG. Colin was talking about some of the machine learning that he's going to lead on habit formation. So he's going to talk about getting into the financial domain, which is one of our 3 pillars that we haven't touched yet. He's going to try to get you guys excited about opportunities.
Thank you, Angela and Katie. So I actually changed my mind, and maybe it's not easy to type here, but I have a new title, which is how can we pick a problem with a greater chance of success? So this is actually what I want to talk about today, and actually, ask you for help. Every time I talk about Save More Tomorrow to industry people, I start by saying that Taylor and I really wanted to help people save, and I said, oh no, we didn't, I'm lying. We actually wanted to help people lose weight. And we wanted to tackle all the other problems that are so much more difficult. But savings is actually so easy because once you put them on an autopilot, you don't have to worry about the change persisting. So I think the financial domain might actually give us some areas which are much easier to actually get big effects than actually dealing with diet. If you think about automatic enrollment and the work of John Bashir and others in 401k plans, I mean, it's so easy for people then to save. You do it for them, and that's it. And if they don't want to save, they have to actually opt out. So you change the behavior in a way that is so trivial in that domain. So why can't we do it with diets? Because the domain is so much more difficult. The equivalent would be that when they get to the restaurant, the right food shows up on the table and temptations are out of the way. The table next to them, nobody is going to get dessert. They know that Shlomi has to sit at the table when there are no temptations. In 401k plans, we take the money out of your paycheck before you see it. You don't think about spending it. There's no chocolates next to you. So there's something about certain domains that make it a lot easier than other domains. And obviously, we want to tackle the difficult problems too. But there's probably a reason why the success of Save More Tomorrow would be very difficult to replicate in other domains. So what I thought to do today is actually to ask for your feedback. Whether we should, if we think about financial decisions, should we focus on savings? And if it's savings, should we actually bother to focus on employer-sponsored plans, like 401k plans? Or maybe it's something we should focus on the Uber drivers who actually don't have a stable paycheck and are going to be more and more part of the economy? Or should we actually pick something totally different in financial services? Lots of people lack insurance and so on. So the way I thought to do it was just to talk about some companies that might be a platform for us, whether we use them or not. And hopefully at some point we'll find kind of a big place to run 20 studies about some important financial decision. But as I'm going through this, I don't want to toss out opportunities that might not fit the big theme and 20 projects running simultaneously. So if I talk about something that you still want to run with them, something independently, just let me know as well, because, there'll be some mega studies, but obviously there'll be a lot of non-mega studies as well. So let me start with a traditional 401k record keeper, Evoya, probably a name many of you are not familiar with, but they're the third largest 401k provider in the country. Think about them as a Fidelity or a Vanguard. I'm not going to go through all the details. You could look later at what we can or cannot do. I'm going to go through it very quickly. But this would be a place where we could decide as a team that what we want to actually do is focus on 401k plans and people who have a retirement plan at their workplace. Now, we do know how to get them all to save, just automatically enroll them. It's pretty easy, but half of employers, for whatever reason, are not interested in automatic enrollment. So that raises two questions. Should we actually put some of our efforts at an employer level rather than individuals? But should we actually have solutions how to get people to save when the employer is uncomfortable about automatic enrollment? I'll skip all those details. This is really more later if you care to kind of look at them. But the scale is there, 5 million people, that's a big player. And they do have experience running RCTs, which is not trivial, as Katie and Angela and some of you ran field experiments can tell you. A lot of mega companies don't know how to randomize, and the devil is in the details, and it's always more complicated. As a matter of fact, actually, John Bashir and I ran a study with them where we actually changed the default saving rates of people, and we learned that you can actually push the envelope a lot you could actually have people enroll at 10% and they don't run away, they don't get scared, and all that happens in the worst case actually, which was a big surprise, they actually engage, lower it to something they're comfortable at. They don't just take it as is, which we were really surprised. We thought that if you're gonna actually push the envelope and want people at very high rates, either they're gonna run away, they'll opt out, or they'll stick to the very high rate blindly and then pile credit card debt because they're saving maybe too much. None of that happened in the data. Okay, so half the country has access to a 401k or something like it, an employer-sponsored plan. Slightly more than half the country, actually, people do not have access. So if we want to help America save, if that was the decision of what we want to focus on and move the needle, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, the Ultimo is probably the best coffee shop in town. Those people working there don't have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan. So they don't have the ability to actually have the money go out of their paycheck straight into a retirement plan. Acorn is another, what I used to say, a little company down the street, but we now have 4 million paying users, so we're not so small. It's a company that is most known for actually using a very cute behavioral trick, save the change. So they virtually, you go buy coffee, you pay $3.50, you charge $4, and the 50 cents goes into an investment account. Others have thought about this trick. Bank of America did it years ago. They're the first to actually be able to invest. You could literally invest tiny amounts in the market. So they found a way to actually slice mutual fund shares into little things so that every time you drink coffee, you can keep investing in the market. But they're a lot more ambitious. They obviously realize that by having people invest the change, they're not going to save a lot of money. So they've started experimenting with other ways to make people save. And one of the ideas they had was that people would put, $20 every month into a saving account. They're a fintech company. They obviously, DNA is to run experiments, a lot easier than, say, doing it with just throwing names at Bank of America or Fidelity. We did one very cute study. Hal Hirschfield, is Hal here today?
He was invited, but he isn't.
He's not here, okay. In any case, we ran a cute study where we actually told people they should save, $5 a day rather than $35 a week. So we frame savings as daily amounts rather than weekly or monthly amounts. 4 times as many actually save. So it is a domain that, for reasons that I can't always articulate, you could get some big effects. So maybe it's a domain we should think about, but I think the bottom line is you got all the people who are interested apparently in saving, otherwise we wouldn't get 4 million users, and the cost of acquisition of clients is very low. People are actually interested in this, but you got all the people who don't have a 401k plan, they want to save. Should we actually focus on them? Because as we move into the gig economy, there'll be more and more people who don't have access to a traditional retirement plan. This is kind of an equivalent from the UK, but more at kind of a national level. In the UK, actually, they instituted automatic enrollment for all employees, even if it's one employee at the company. So it's like across the board, everyone needs to be automatically enrolled. There's some players, one that is kind of a quasi-government, non-for-profit player called Nest, and others can compete for that business too. But Nest is a very big player in that, and they actually are very keen in testing, how to lower opt-out rates. which has been actually pretty low in the UK. Everyone predicted it would be 40%, and it ended up being in the 8%, but that's still 1 million people who opted out. And they're very keen actually in reducing that to the extent possible, but also the problem with all those automatic enrollment programs, especially if you do it at the, at the countrywide level, you set it at pretty low rates because it's going to politically be very difficult to get anything to pass where people are automatically enrolled at much higher rates. So people say very little. Now that creates all sorts of side effects as well about the economics of those plans, because with the small accounts, the cost relative to the size of the account are generally high. So they're very interested in having people save more. They are a digital player as well. They're kind of, an organization that was built as kind of the anti-traditional, big, expensive, old-fashioned financial institutions. So it's another place where things could be tested. And they do get kind of more of the smaller employer, the gig economy people. Okay, going a bit to another area, still about saving, but something actually quite different. So a huge problem with saving is actually emergency savings. And I forgot the exact statistics, but as a rule of thumb, it's kind of 50% of the people can't find $500, and 25% of the people can't find $250. Now, don't quote me exactly, but it's a very good rule of thumb. So we used to talk about, what happens when your car breaks and you can't get to work and you don't have the money to pay for it. Nowadays, I guess, what happens when your phone breaks and you can't get a phone and you don't know actually which bus takes you to work and so on. But Sunbit is trying to virtually eliminate payday lending, which is a very expensive way of getting money. They think that with a bit of data, they can really screen people who had their car broken or lost their iPhone, who have a medical bill and they need the money, but they can actually figure out who is worthy of that money without sending them to a payday loan, and they could do it a lot cheaper. Now, I think that's a lot less of an interest to us, but those are the kind of players who get actually quite a bit of volume too, and are very keen on finding ways to drive people to create emergency saving accounts so that next time their car breaks, they have the money on the side. And this is a huge problem. I mean, emergency saving is a humongous problem in the US and elsewhere. So, this is really more kind of to say that there's a lot of players out there in the different segments of savings, whether it is traditional retirement plans, whether it is gig economy, people who don't have a retirement plan, whether it is emergency saving. Throughout the spectrum, there'll be opportunities, and I think it's more for us to decide what we want to focus on. And obviously, a lot of the companies that might want to work with us might not be able to deliver, so there'll be all of those issues as well. I thought at the end to actually just throw one more thing into the pile. I'm not going to, which is all the insurance industry. We don't have to work on savings. There's a lot of papers on savings in behavioral economics, and you should probably blame Richard and me and save more tomorrow. Probably for every 10 papers that we have about getting people to save for retirement, maybe we have one paper about what people do with their money in retirement, which is probably equally important, and then probably a fraction of that on other financial decisions. So we don't have to focus on saving for retirement. We could pick any other financial decision. There are a lot of fintech companies in the insurance space. It doesn't matter which one I'll bring here. But there is what I think is fair to say is a protection gap. There's lots of insurance features that that people need that they don't have. And I think about it as people buy too much insurance, like they have very low deductibles, which is often, incredibly expensive. You could literally find cases that lowering the deductible from $1,000 to $500 will cost you $800. So you should never do it because you pay upfront whether something will break or not more than the reduction in the deductible. So people accidentally buy too much insurance. When we talk about, warranties for, your new iPhone that could cost whatever hundreds of dollars and things like that people probably shouldn't buy either. But I think the big buckets where people don't have enough insurance. I mean, so many people that actually have one parent making money and don't have life insurance if something happens to the main income earner in the family, and so on. Should we tackle that? And I think I'll stop here because I do have 3 minutes, I'm told, and I want maybe more questions. But I think it's a domain where historically there have been big success stories, and maybe it's just an easier problem to solve. But I think it will really depend on what problems will get you all excited as opposed to what we think. So I got 2 minutes left for questions. So maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then we'll stay on time. Maybe not. Maybe we'll stay on time.
I wanted to ask, with the insurance problem, over-insuring, I just realized I'd over-insured my iPhone, or under-insuring. I do have life insurance, which is good. Is it mostly an information gap, or is it a self-control? What's the main diagnosis?
I don't know that I've thought about it enough. I haven't done much in insurance. I think the biggest problem might be attention. Nobody got any bandwidth these days. So these are things that probably you have to first have the bandwidth to think about. I don't think people think about it. But I think the second problem, and I think that's a huge one, is the complexity. And that's where I think a lot could be done. It's just so complicated to actually buy insurance. And the places that try to make it easy online often compete just by price. And I went to Lemonade. How many of you heard about Lemonade? So they're selling insurance online. They're getting a lot of attention, and very, very successful commercially. And I tried to insure my home there, and the premiums were half of what I pay with AAA, literally half. Now, I looked at the footnotes, and they offered me 20% of the coverage. So virtually, I would be able to rebuild another bathroom, but that's me. So I got half the premiums for 20% of the coverage. So it's a problem because the complexity is an obstacle, but those who make it easy sometimes just have a gimmick. And I think it's a place where maybe we could make a difference. We haven't, ventured into other financial decisions as well. There are a lot of them. So anyway, I got 30 seconds left. I think I'm just gonna thank you. But if you one-to-one independently study here and there with one of the opportunities, let me know. But more importantly, if you kind of start thinking about what should be the next problem we'll tackle, then please share it with me, Angela, Katie, because if we're going to work on it as a team, then we all should be excited. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much to Katie and Angela for hosting this event. It's a great deal of fun. This talk is based on the paper mentioned here below, although I'm going to deviate from it for a little bit in a way I'll explain very precisely. Here's the story. As Bob mentioned earlier today, we're really living in a golden age age of behavioral science. And I'm not sure exactly how to break it down, but one landmark for me, at least, is a decade or so ago when Richard and Cass published their book Nudge. Since then, we've really seen an explosion of interest among researchers, among practitioners, in developing and deploying nudges, or more broadly, I'm not sure which term you like, behavioral science interventions in the service of the public good, helping people make better decisions, arrive at better outcomes. Now, I think a lot of you in this room, and I'll certainly include myself, are enthusiastic proponents of this movement. So I'm imagining a number of you, and again, I include myself here, have found yourself in the position of offering arguments in favor of the notion that nudging in public policy and managerial applications is a good idea. One argument that you have probably used, among others, sounds something like this. If we are going to think about how one implements a nudge, we can often do it at little or no cost. So to the extent that it drives behavior change in the right direction, in a positive direction, which we judge by some other metric, why would we not engage in that sort of policymaking or in that sort of managerial design, okay? Now, I think that argument has been given out quite casually, and so a number of us, and that includes Katie, that includes Richard, that includes Shlomo, Cass as well, and me, we decided we were going to try to do the calculations underlying that claim a little bit more carefully, a little bit more systematically, and spoiler alert, the calculations turn out the way most of us in this room would have expected, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a good idea to do that, right? So what we did, very briefly put, and I'll explain in more detail in a moment, is we grabbed research from the relatively recent past, I think the past 15 to 20 years, both from nudges and from what we call traditional interventions. So these are things like tax incentives or financial incentives more generally. These are things like information provision. And we tried to do our best apples to apples comparison. So similar domain, same outcome variable. And we did very simple calculations for each intervention where we take a ratio, a numerator, which is the marginal impact of the intervention on the target behavior, and the denominator is the number of dollars you spend on that intervention. So it's roughly speaking a little bit of a return on investment type of calculation. The nudges fare quite well by this metric relative to the standard intervention. So part one of the talk today is going to be called a public service announcement. When you do find yourself in the position of advocating in favor of a behavioral science approach or technique applied to a particular situation, now you have not just the casual argument, but a little bit more of a systematic set of calculations to back up what you're saying. And then part two, so part one, I think I can speak for all of my collaborators on this work. Part two, maybe I deviate off the rails from their perspective a little bit. I'll start to engage in some editorializing where we might go from here, and you can ascribe that to me. I can't speak for my collaborators after that point in time. So let's go with part one. What did we do so that you have some of the details behind these calculations? We started by identifying major areas of domestic policy that at the time either the behavioral insights team in the UK or the social and behavioral sciences team in the US were working on. Okay, those areas are listed on the left here, and then for each of those domestic policy areas, we looked for one outcome variable that we could track. In some cases, that was just called the obvious outcome variable. So for energy, we looked at energy consumption, or where we think of reducing residential energy consumption as moving things in the right direction. In other cases where it was less obvious, say health, we looked for an outcome variable that the behavioral insights team or the social and behavioral sciences team was studying. And then once we identified each of those outcome variables, we did a literature search going back to the year 2000, again, for both the nudge interventions and the traditional interventions. We limited ourselves to top journals that would be publishing research pertaining to those, just to kind of maintain a little bit of reasonableness to how much we had to invest in understanding all the different aspects of the literature. And then once we found those papers, we did exactly the calculation that I mentioned. Numerator is marginal impact of the intervention on the behavior that's being targeted, and then the denominator is the cost of that intervention. To walk you through one of those calculations, here's an example. It's an easy one for me to talk about because it's based on a paper that Katie and I worked on with James Choi, David Leibson, and Bridget Maidman a while ago. It's a planning prompt intervention trying to boost the number of people who are getting flu vaccines. So we worked with a company that was already offering free workplace flu shot clinics to its employees and was already sending mailers to those employees informing them about the details of those clinics. Our intervention embedded in a randomly assigned subset of the mailers was a planning prompt nudge. We asked people to write down the date and time when they planned to get their flu shot. And it wasn't a reservation or an appointment. It wasn't a plan you were sharing with anyone else necessarily. You could just write it down for yourself. And it's a personal thing, private potentially. What we found was that relative to the control, which didn't receive the planning prompt, 4.2 percentage point increase in the take-up rate of flu shots. When you scale that by the number of employees who were impacted, we're calculating that gave us 53 incremental flu shots. That's going to be the numerator of our calculation. The denominator is the cost. And given that they were already offering the flu shots, already sending out the mailers, really this was the cost of the programmer who implemented this additional piece of the letter that was going on. I think we kind of overestimated it, but just to be conservative, let's say this takes 5 hours of that person's time to program, $75 an hour, maybe the going rate for this type of programmer at the time we launched that study, so $375 total. We translated everything into $2015 for these calculations, so that's $416. 53 divided by 416 gives us 12.8 flu shots per $100 spent. And we did that for this paper. We did it for a number of other papers, both the nudges and the traditional interventions. Here's what we found. So the nudges are at the top in the black bars. This is the one I just walked you through. This is Gretchen's beautiful default appointment nudge. And then we found some literature on monetary incentives or an educational campaign. And what you can see, just sort of popping out at you immediately, is that the nudges do pretty well. It's not a complete dominance relationship. This educational campaign, for whatever reason, seemed to do pretty well. But this is a case where the nudges are I think, delivering bang for our buck in a very nice way. It gets even better as we move through the different policy domains that we studied. So here are the results when we look at energy. We're trying to reduce residential energy consumption. The famous O-Power nudge is delivering 27 point.
What do those numbers mean? What is 27 point?
Yeah, I was about to say that. So 27.3 is the number of kilowatt hours saved per dollar spent from this nudge.
That's not an easily interpretable number.
Well, but they can be easily compared to each other. Yeah, that's the whole point. Yeah.
How did you get the cost information from studies done by others?
So we email people when it wasn't readily available, and there are different methods. Sometimes it was actually embedded in the text of the paper. In the case of the O-Power nudge, this Alcott study actually directly reports. Turns out it's the inverse of the ratio that we wanted. So all we need to do is 1 over that. But actually, this paper, for example, is very good at reporting its cost. In the case of financial incentives, it's pretty. We've attributed most of the cost to, well, how much money did you give out in the form of rewards for a particular behavior? Yeah.
And did you only select a few selected studies, or how did you select studies within the energy sector, or are these the only studies?
Yeah. So there's a lengthy appendix that you can go to if you want to see all the details. In short, the major way we limited the number of studies was we limited the journals that we were looking at. So we were looking at basically top 3 journals in economics, top 3 in psychology, et cetera. And we'll get to issues of sample selection in just a moment. But that was the primary method by which we narrowed things down. And of course, we also narrow things down by intentionally choosing just one outcome variable. In this case, residential energy consumption. In another case, flu shots. Yep.
Is this going to depend a lot on the marginal fixed costs? Like in your health example,
Great.
it got a firm of 1,000, but if it was
Yeah.
100,000,
Totally, yeah. So this is another point I'll raise in just a moment. But certainly a big part of this depends on what the existing infrastructure is and what is already, in a way, a sunk cost. In that case, they were already running the flu shot clinic. but that point is to come. Let me just describe the results, and then I think we're going to get into a lot of the questions that people are asking right now. So for savings, what we found was an active decision nudge, actually delivering about $100 in increased savings in a given year for $1 spent on the intervention. Compare that to tax incentives, compare that to other matching type arrangements. The nudges are winning quite handily in that situation. And then the best result for nudging is if you look at education, where now we're saying for $1,000 spent, how many additional students do you get attending post-secondary institutions? The Benjer et al., including others, form streamlining nudge, helping people fill out the FAFSA, is about 2 orders of magnitude better than providing direct financial incentives or tax credits. Okay, but yeah, so let's move. I think everyone gets the picture from those sorts of calculations. Let's move now to how we think about this. And here, I'm going to start representing my own views and not necessarily those of my collaborators. Okay. One thing that you might be concerned about is, like, well, are we so sure that it's socially beneficial to increase take-up of flu shots or energy conservation or retirement savings or college enrollment in the first place? And here, actually, I think we're just going to sidestep the question. What I would say is if we take policy objectives as given, what we want to do is choose among interventions that are addressing those barriers and helping us pursue those objectives in as cost-effective manner as possible. Okay, and you may debate like, well, actually, we don't think there is too much energy being used. People are using an appropriate amount of energy. That's fine. I mean, I think you can look to some other domains as well, and perhaps say, okay, well, the same point holds there. So it seems to hold across a few different domains. But now let's think about this issue of sample selection in a way. So what if the procedure for selecting policy areas and the procedure for selecting outcome variables is identifying domains where nudging is particularly effective? On the one hand, I think this actually reflects reality. So policymakers or managers can choose. They can be selective when they're deciding to apply a nudge in one case or another. And then on the other hand, I think I would also say that we probably care just about the domains that we studied in the first place. So even if you say, well, it only really applies to the domains which you did these calculations in, I might be fine with that because we do care about retirement savings. We do care about reducing energy consumption. We do care about flu shots, et cetera. Now, are we worried about publication bias? First thing I'll note there is, perhaps we see effects that are too large relative to the true effect because of publication bias. A similar concern might apply to traditional interventions. And even then, let's say you're worried that, well, the publication bias is somehow more severe in the nudge case than in the traditional intervention case. And here's where actually the low cost of implementing nudges really comes to the rescue, because we can say, well, that may be true, but you can go off and replicate the effect of the nudge on your own, often at low cost. And if it turns out that the effect size is a little bit smaller than we initially expected, that may very well be fine. Maybe you can find something better. At the very least, you haven't spent a lot of resources on learning that additional piece of information. What about the point that we should be comparing nudges and traditional interventions when they were applied to the same population at the same time with the same background environment? We completely agree with that point. We were just kind of working with what was available. But here's where I can start to be a little bit prescriptive and say, well, in future research, and BCFG is a wonderful example of this, we should attempt to provide such comparisons when we can. And it's not just nudges versus traditional interventions, but also various nudges versus each other. So BCFG is really answering the call on this particular point. And here's one that I'd really like to emphasize. So what if the nudges have all sorts of unintended side effects, so the unintended consequences critique? Or what if the people who are impacted by nudges aren't benefiting as much from the behavior as the people who are impacted by traditional interventions? And again, I'll say this sort of concern is not unique to nudges. This applies also to traditional interventions. And again, I can call for future research here. So I think it's incumbent upon us as behavioral scientists to really pay attention to this issue that others are going to be leveling against the broad effort, which is, well, you've measured the impact on a targeted behavior, but what about all these other things that could be going on? I think we really need to start worrying about that, measuring behaviors and outcomes other than the ones that we are specifically targeting. And as a final note, this is really speaking to Phil's point. So, I don't want to overclaim here. So one thing you might take from this is, well, let's just throw away the traditional interventions and go only with the nudges. And I think that would be a great mistake, right? So the traditional interventions, the tax incentives, whatever it is, might be best for handling certain problems, like externalities. And of course, I think this is really Phil's point, everything that we've done here, all of our calculations are marginal effects. So we're taking as given the status quo, all the existing policies that are already in place. And what we're really saying is that if we're spending the marginal dollar, it looks like nudges have quite a bit of value. And I think what really underlies that is the fact that they're going to be complementary. So nudges, for example, might help someone take advantage of an existing traditional intervention that is already in place, lowering the cost of accessing a particular resource. So to conclude, I think increased investment in nudges is warranted. A lot of people already seem to be getting on board with this idea, but now you have the calculations behind it to back you up. In the future, we should be measuring the impact of an intervention per dollar spent, not just the effect size in absolute terms, so we can do these sorts of comparisons. And then if we are going to be considering nudges alongside traditional interventions, sort of on the same par as each other, as part of the toolbox for managers and policymakers, we should be bringing to bear the same policy evaluation machinery, worrying about unintended consequences, worrying about distributional impacts that we've been applying all along for decades to traditional interventions. So sorry for going a little over time, but I will leave it at that. Do we have time for questions, or should we just go to lunch?
How about one question then lunch?
Yeah.
No pressure.
Okay, yeah.
Just one more point on this marginal.
Yeah.
Is how much you can move the dial. So if you're comparing, say, a nudge to get people into college versus tutoring for students, the tutoring may be way more expensive, but it may, so bang for the buck.
Yes.
The getting more people into college may be more cost effective.
Right.
But in terms of like making a aggregated policy difference, the tutoring may still be worthwhile but more expensive.
Great, yeah. And one way I try to just talk about that point is there are probably going to be decreasing returns to the incremental nudge, right? So to the extent that we want to spend a lot of dollars on nudges, we might not be able to do so because we kind of run out of things to do, whereas we can continue to spend additional resources on mentoring is a great example, a very human intensive and therefore very costly type of intervention. And so I think I just will say I wholeheartedly agree. But really what I want to emphasize is that where we stand today, and I think our calculations can speak to that, there is still quite high marginal returns to the incremental nudge. So thanks for that. Yeah, turn back to Katie.
Thank you so much, John.